Thank you all for coming, everybody. My name is Rob Dubbin. I'm a developer and a writer for the Colbert Report while it existed. I discovered Star Control in 1992 after a hurricane destroyed my house. I'm happy to tell the rest of that story, but later, because none of you are here to see me. So please, if you'll join me in welcoming to the stage two of my heroes, Fred Ford and Paul Reiche III. Thank you.
Thanks, Rob, and everybody.
Hello, friends. Welcome to your autopsy. Let's just start at the beginning, take it back, and Fred, how'd you guys meet each other?
Well, we met each other through mutual friends who worked with me, and some of them grew up with Paul. And at the time, I was leaving a fairly normal corporate job, looking for something different, and Paul was looking for an engineer to help realize his design.
Yeah, luckily we had Greg Johnson, a great developer and one of the designers on Starflight, had a game night at his house in San Rafael, and a lot of us went to that. And we sort of got set up on a development date to meet at game night. And as usual, I lost at whatever game it was. But the bottom line was we were both looking, so I was looking for a programmer, Fred was looking for an artist designer, and it was just sort of being at the right place at the right time. But we had both, this was in late 1988, early 1989, we had both been making games for 7 or 8 years at that point. And Fred had been at UC Berkeley at the same time, and starting in 1980, but we didn't know it. So actually, after we got together, we began working on a multi-deal contract I'd signed with Accolade, the first multi-deal contract I'd ever signed. And I actually signed it without having any other development partners. So it was a sort of gutsy move.
The lone survivor.
The other two games didn't necessarily work out so well, but Star Control did.
Yeah, so we're actually talking about two games here today, and I'm not going to make you guys tell us what makes Star Control sort of collectively a classic game. Instead, I'll sort of take a stab at it. It's this massive game that sprawls out over the course of years, and a quarter of a galaxy with a dozen alien races, and everyone, despite that scale, every one of the players' actions still feels sort of purposeful in the moment. And it's also hilarious, a major influence for me as a comedy writer. But I want to ask, show of hands, who here has played Star Control 2? Yeah, all right. And no, keep your hands up. Leave your hand up if you've beaten Star Control 2, and put your hand down if you haven't. OK, nice. Now leave your hand up if you beat it without hints, and put your hand down if you haven't. Yeah, see, so it's also really hard. And I think that's also sort of a sneaky marker of a classic game, is that there's a challenge that persists over time. So I want to talk a little bit. Paul, tell me about, this is something you said to me when we were talking through this, getting ready for it, that you embrace standing on the shoulders of others. So could you tell me a little bit about some of the influences that went into sort of designing this universe?
Sure. First off, embracing someone while standing on their shoulders is a proof of our flexibility and balance. We grew up, as probably many of the people here did, in the 60s and early 70s within the context of some classic science fiction and fantasy that was written at that time. The Zero Stone was the first book I remember my parents reading to me by Andrea Norton. And early in the 70s, we sort of stumbled into Jack Vance, mostly through our D&D connections.
And probably most of you haven't read Jack Vance, but if you have, he writes about very exaggerated societies, societies taken to an extreme. He has characters who are all very smart, have an agenda that's interesting, and they're very committed to their agenda. And he never over-describes anything. He'll describe something just enough so that you can fill in the blanks with your imagination. And if you read the book 20 years later, it's not ruined for you because he over-describes something to the point where it no longer makes sense in the future context. So
he's also fairly elemental in the early Dungeons & Dragons magic system. He wrote stories in the 40s and 50s, and just sort of off the top of his head, Fandal's excellent prismatic spray, just wrote that out. And then the memorization system and many of the spells that Dungeons & Dragons started with were taken from him.
Huh. Oh, that guy. So you also had some video game influences that I wanted to talk about that you shared, actually, without realizing it.
Yeah, this was interesting because when we were both going to Cal, as far as I know, we never met each other, but we both frequented a pinball and arcade place at Cal named the Silver Ball. And I actually, when I was going to Cal, was working at a game company to put myself through school, and the owner of the game company owned the Silver Ball, and so would give me tokens to play, whereas Paul...
You're lucky.
Yeah.
So what you see on the screen here is, on the left, one of the first, maybe the first combat video game, Space Wars, which I believe was made at MIT, on early computers that looked more like oscilloscopes. But it was fundamentally two people blasting away at each other, and immensely popular there and at other universities. In the late 70s, a Berkeley resident decided that he could implement it as a stand-up arcade system, and Silverball was his test facility. And so he brought in this sort of homebrew arcade system with a great big numeric keypad on the front, and that was Space Wars, and that was the best fun ever, blasting your friends to bits.
Yeah. Well, Paul, you've been a working game designer for just about as long as I've been a working human, and I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about your work before Star Control.
Sure. Well, paper gaming started in the late 70s and early 80s. I have a friend, Errol Otis, who I was fortunate enough to meet in high school, and he and I published some paper products coming out of high school, and then he went to TSR Hobbies, home of Dungeons & Dragons, and I was able to follow him there as a writer. I had grown up at the Lawrence Hall of Science in the Berkeley Hills learning about programming. I was horrible at it. But it led us eventually to meet a guy named John Freeman, who had founded Automated Simulations, one of the first computer gaming companies. And he wanted to start a new company, a new studio, and that launched Archon and Murder on the Zindernef with Electronic Arts' first batch of 7 games. And we did a number of games there after that. Starflight actually is not something I can take credit for, but it's something that there was a blissful 2 weeks when I got to work on it. I was actually supposed to be working on mail-order monsters, and I met Greg Johnson and just became fascinated with him as a person and this idea of an expansive science fiction game that sort of fulfilled my Larry Niven fantasies, my Andrea Norton Zero Stone fantasies. So I went over there to his house and hung out with him for 2 weeks talking about the communication system. And in Murder on the Zindernef, which none of you will probably remember except Robert Leyland, if he's here, programmed it. It had a posture-based communication system where you would say, I am going to be forceful and I'm going to make a statement. And then you would be surprised by the statement you made, and then you would see the statement that whatever the response was. So we talked about introducing that into Starflight, and that's fundamentally how you communicated in that game. And then my producer found out I was no longer working on mail-order monsters and said, you actually have a contract to finish this game, so please come back.
Friendly way of introducing legalities into the conversation. Fred, around the same time, you worked on a game called Pillbox, which appears to have been made for Walkman.
Yeah, I actually did a number of games for Japanese personal computers that were emerging at that time, and they were all done for Japan, so none of them were released in the U.S. But that company sadly went out of business right as I was graduating, and I kind of went into the wilderness of the corporate world for a while thinking I should really get a real job until I came to my senses.
Thankfully.
So the two of you together, not everyone necessarily knows this because your careers go back so far. I've also worked together on some more recent games, which some people in the audience may have heard of, especially around the holidays. But in between, you made this game called Star Control, winner of 1990's cover model, Almost in Need of a Manicure. And so, you know, I'm interested to know when you got together and you finally were like, we should partner on this, like what, Paul, what your shared vision for the game kind of was and what you wanted to do with it.
Well, I mean, at its core, it was initially described as science fiction Archon. And fundamentally, that is letting two people compete with one another with asymmetric combatants, players that don't have the same powers, players in which the matchup of individual characters are a learned ability. You know, learning to fight one another is fun and a long-term process. So Star Control turned that into the science fiction world, and we began building spaceships. And actually, Fred had to build everything from the ground up for this.
Yeah, this was where we learned how, not only how to work together, but just how to finish something together. And so it's a much smaller game than its successor, Star Control 2. We spent less time on it, but also we just spent a lot of time figuring out how we could work together and how that all went.
There's a real quick funny story about the Star Control cover. Can I talk about that for just a sec?
Sorry?
The Star Control cover, they,
Oh, yeah.
we ended up bringing this game out on the Sega Genesis in a non-authorized by the first party Sega Genesis cartridge, which it turned out caused a lot of legal kerfuffle. But nonetheless, Accolade decided they wanted to re-release it with new covers. And they said, hey, Paul, we're getting a new artist to re-illustrate your cover. What would you like him to do? And I was like, oh, you know, it's kind of a cool cover. Just render it maybe a little more tightly. And they're like, OK. And a few weeks later, I got the Boris Vallejo painting, which was just a slightly improved version of that. And I was like, I could have told Boris Vallejo to paint anything. And bless him, he just did exactly what we asked him and gave us this very nicely rendered, smooth cover.
True professional, you know? It's the guy you want on your cover. So the game, you shipped it, it went out, and it did really well. It was number 5 on the charts in all of America just a couple months after it was released. And, you know, so many people now release games, and it takes maybe a few months of, you know, really rigorous PR and stuff like that to find its following. But Star Control did right away. It totally destroyed Bandit Kings of China.
Take that.
Ancient China, you know. Go back to ancient China, Bandit Kings. You know, so almost immediately, you know, things started to change. Fred, you described this time as a time of great technological change, and there was a lot happening in sort of the graphical side of computer games.
Yeah, so when we did Star Control 1, we had to support the CGA 4 colors, VGA 16 colors, and VGA 256 colors. A lot of the people in this audience probably have only dealt with true colors, but back then we had to walk uphill both ways through the snow to get our colors. It wasn't just colors. There was audio, I think you...
Yeah, totally. And yeah, you described the sound card that you made. This was Star Control 1, right? It was the ad lib. It sounded something like this. Sort of like a kitchen has come to life at night.
Yeah, so Star Control 1 was purely synthesized audio on the PC. And it was only when we started to port it to the Amiga and then later the Sega Genesis that we started adding digital audio to it. And that probably led us to discovering the mod file format, which is a 4-channel digital sample sort of programmed audio format. And here's an example of that.
You guys sort of found these. You got everyone you walked in. Obviously, so many of you played the game, you recognize the music from Star Control 2. But I don't think everyone necessarily knows where you got that music.
Well, so we went on. We fell in love with this format. The European demo scene was using it a lot, and so we went scavenging source code and found it in Finnish.
Yeah, I found a Finnish source code, and we had to translate their comments into English so we could understand what the code was doing. And
then eventually, so we had this great, you know, 4-channel digital music playing, and then we're like, all right, now let's rush out with our $3,000 budget and get 30 music themes, only to discover that as far as we could tell, no one in the United States was using it. So we decided, how do we get all these themes for such a small amount of money? And there's this thing called the internet. Let's use that. And breaking many, I guess, rules/practices at that time, we broadcast into the news groups, into Usenet, this, hey, we have a contest, $500 first prize and $50, we're going to have $50 second prizes. And so we started getting discs from all over the world. We got, from Los Angeles, from Finland, from Norway, from Middle America. And to this day, we have actually, I don't think, ever had a face-to-face meeting with any of the people who supplied our music, but we ended up writing back and getting more music out of the ones who were the most prolific. And I think one of them may have been 14 at the time and was very careful not to tell us.
We deny that.
Yeah, right. Yeah, we do not, Activision, we do not use underage employment at our office. But the bottom line was we ended up with music that sounded quite different than most other American games, and I think actually, personally, still holds up today as far as character-rich music.
No, I mean...
Also, Errol Otis, again, who shows up a lot in this conversation, wrote the Urquan theme. And he was a musician on top of everything else, and he used a very high-end music synthesizer to create the Urquan theme, which we would then sort of reverse engineered into a mod.
Yeah, so this is sort of the technological, oh, let me get out of this guy. This is the technological backdrop against which you started developing what you described at the time as a crossover action strategy game. So I'm curious, similar to Star Control 1, what did you want to accomplish with Star Control 2? What was your thinking?
Well, and just starting with Archon, we like to build hybrid games, games that defy a simple genre description. And so in Star Control, it was a hybrid of fast action, which on the PC wasn't that familiar, with the sort of three-dimensional space strategy, and also using up to 10 keys simultaneously, which I don't think many people have had many keys being pressed by two players at once on a keyboard. We actually had to Fred had to create a special program to let people overcome this keyboard lockout, which was apparently different on every single keyboard. So people would poke around trying to find the right keys.
Yeah, it drove our publishers crazy that they could never classify our games, but oh well.
Well, when we were preparing for this, you guys gave me access to sort of this giant trove of contemporary documents that you had from the time that you dug up, for the purposes of this postmortem. And some of them were like in old file folders, some of them were like in like a 6-deep subdirectory prison in DOS. But this is actually the pitch document when you were trying to sell your publisher on the idea of you doing a Star Control 2. Paul, I wonder, can you read the first sentence for us?
Okay. Star Control 2 will use much of the code and data developed for Star Control 1 and add on a good, though not necessarily epic, role-playing shell. That was a lie.
I don't know if it's possible not to lie if you have the words "not necessarily" inside parentheses.
And in terms of getting greenlit on games and lying, I don't do that anymore. Activision friends,
On it.
Well, and you were optimistic in a way. You said realistically, I don't think this can be done in 12 months. Probably 14 to 18 is more on target. Remind us how long it actually took.
Ooh, about 2 years, I guess.
So there's a good 6 months unaccounted for there, and yet at the time, the concern field on this pitch was blank.
Proposals.
Yeah, you should have seen the first 3 proposals.
Very optimistic. On top of everything, you were a major influence for Kickstarter. And so you got to work feeding the hungry monster, as you described it, making this game. And as I'm given to understand, the hungry monster refers to you, Fred.
Yeah, so more than anything, our development process was finding neat little segments of interactivity, whether it's the mod player or whether it's a rotating planet or whether it's space combat, and we would have an idea about a nugget of interactivity, and I would necessarily have to start making the code backbone to support that, and I would get that ready, and then I would need data, and I would say, Paul, I need data, and he would.
I'd fire up DPaint and start painting like crazy. And by the time I had 16 rotations of a ship done, Fred was ready for 10 more ships. And by the time we had 10 more ships done, and to get it done, that's when we'd start having to call friends and volunteers and hire anyone we could find to help feed this hungry data monster, because Fred was the sole programmer on this, but he could stay ahead of us And so there was always this like, well, we don't want to waste any of his time, so quick, everybody get this work done. And he'd be ready for the next part, whether it's, please give me 30 mods now. Please, let's do 16 more ships.
Yeah, and it seems like iteration was sort of a big part of your process generally. I found this handwritten, heavily edited draft of the intro text, which even if you didn't get very far into Star Control 2, you saw this. It's the big cinematic stage setting sort of voice of God telling you what you're getting yourself into. And,
yeah, you can tell this is my writing. Fred's looks like a typewriter. And we started writing scripts and then discovering that, well, that's boring, that's too long, and stripping it down and stripping it down and stripping it down.
Yeah, right there in the middle, you can see that you were worried that battle thralls didn't sound deadly enough. So you added it in.
Thousands.
Yeah, and so later, then there's this very nice typewritten. I guess Fred, you wrote this by hand, and this is much closer to. In fact, it's the actual text, and then this is how it actually looks in the game, sort of fading in. We don't have the dramatic timpani backbeat,
which you really need for this to feel impressive, but. Sound guy is just bleeding back there.
Sorry.
Sorry about that.
It was for effect. I didn't think about it. It's the casualty of war. This is another thing I found from your guys' process. I wonder if you could, when you talk about having access to new technology.
Sure. So what you're seeing here is, again, beautiful deluxe paint by Dan Silva, greatest program ever. And this is a sprite page. In Star Control 1, we had an asteroid that would float around, but we wanted to go high-tech and use this digitizer we had from DigiView from NewTek. And so we needed an asteroid. And where to get an asteroid? Apparently, you get it at Baker's Square in the parking lot. They had this whole field of pumice. And one day it sort of clicked, oh, my God, those are asteroids. So I bent down and was digging around in the pumice. I never realized I was just stealing their pumice. So I found a good one, and then we glued some sticks on it and very carefully rotated it, and got 16 or 32 rotations, and hence the beautiful asteroid you see in front of you.
Grand Theft Pumice. Yeah.
They want that back.
And another thing that you had in this sort of vault of D-Paint was a lot of rejected or speculative prototypes or ideas for ships.
Yeah, I wouldn't say they were rejected. They just, their time has not yet come.
Yeah,
so get a good look,
crazy
everybody.
bondage monster is coming someday, I'm sure.
Yeah, Paul sees a bondage monster in the upper left. I see Yosemite Sam.
We see what we want to see, Fred.
It was always dangerous when we approved that funding for him to get a space program. You have a drive full of stuff like this. I mean, this sort of locust beast.
Yeah, these are, again, D-Paint images. These were by Leonard Roble, who was, I think, 19 years old. And we had a policy that anybody who found us could use our computers to learn painting or learn programming, whatever they wanted to do, as long as they didn't steal our stuff, and stuck with it. And Leonard stuck with it and became actually quite a good painter and animator. But these were his ideas, which eventually evolved. I think the Zokfot up in the upper right got a recolor job.
Yeah, it's
best ship ever.
It looks like, yeah, there's sort
awesome tongue. Yeah.
Right, some people call it the weakest ship in the galaxy, but
yeah, well, they don't know about the tongue.
And then this is the famous space whale.
So close to entering into the game, that space whale. We had it flying around, its tail was wiggling, and it just we sort of didn't find the magic idea that justified it. Though we have talked now actually several times about your space whale idea.
I had an idea for the space whale. It's a pretty good idea. As a new melee ship,
We'll come back to that later. Maybe.
Sorry?
We'll come back to that later.
Yeah, come find me afterwards. I'll talk about the space whale all day. I want to talk about the fact that, one of the things that's special about Star Control, in my opinion, is that, the more mechanically complicated a game gets, the harder it typically is to tell sort of a compelling story through that game. And vice versa. If it's a game that's typically story-heavy, a lot of times it's sort of mechanically simple to try and accommodate that story. Star Control 2, I think, manages to do both things, to have a ton of systems all interacting with each other and also manage to tell an epic story through those systems. And The UI we're looking at here, this is the star map. And I think this is one of the main ways that you guys accomplish that. So, Paul, if you could tell us sort of what we're looking at here.
Sure. So this is the star map represents the map of space. We flattened space out because it was a little easier to work with. We laid out our own constellations, and that allowed us to craft actually interesting spaces. You know, a green supergiant there surrounded by 6 green dwarfs. And those, in a way, helped us build this sense of an interesting narrative space. This is later in the game where you've actually encountered alien races, and each time you encounter an alien race, its sphere of influence is revealed. And sometimes just the way that they're arranged is sort of giving you a hint. There's 2 great big circles there, which you pretty early on learn is this doctrinal conflict, this great war that's going on between the 2 factions of the Urquan. And then you've got some poor little, like the Supox and the Utwig, who are stuck in the middle of it. And so the way that space is defined starts to tell you a little bit about the relationships of the species.
Yeah, there in the lower left corner, there's the, you all know the Pekunk, and this was a new race for Star Control 2. It's one of the first you encounter. And Fred, tell us a little bit about these guys.
Well, the Pekunk are obviously a toucan-like avian race, and they're, in the story, they're distant cousins of the Yehat, which is a race from Star Control 1. And they're kind of a hippy-dippy, everything's great race, although they do have kind of a mean streak under the surface because they believe if somebody is too perfect, they'll just wrap right around to utter evil.
Morality is assigned value.
But at some point during the adventure game, you can meet up with them and tell them about their cousins, and they suddenly get it into their head that it would be a really good idea to go visit their cousins.
Their cousins, though, are bloodthirsty, warlike creatures who you know ahead of time are going to be trouble for these Pekunk.
And so this is what I mean by using the star map narratively, because when you've played the game for about 10 hours, this happens.
Yeah, and so because you use the star map yourself to sort of set your navigational courses for long trips, you tend to periodically come back to the star map just to make your life easier. And all of a sudden, the star map is telling you a story in nonverbal cues that something is going on down there. And most probably, most of you stopped whatever it was you were about to do and went down to check out, why are these guys doing what they're doing?
I played Star Control 2 with my younger brother, Jeff, and the first time we saw this, it actually kicked off a 10-minute argument about whether it had actually happened or not. And so it really, really gets your attention. And, you know, of course, we dropped everything we were doing to go down there and check it out. And, you know, that's just one corner of the map, so it's an example of sort of how you guys laced this thing with meaning, even if it was just like a UI for navigation. Now, I found this, this is a hot elements list.
Hot elements.
You wrote it around the, you know, when you were nearing completion on the game, you were essentially writing your own PR. And you promised 500 stars, each with unique and varied planets and moons. Now, obviously, compelling procedural generation is a sort of an open problem today to kind of generate a broad variety of, you know, terrains, environments, dialogue, whatever it is, without sort of revealing too much about the systems that are creating that content. So the question is, how did you do it in 1992? And the answer is that it's complicated. This is, Fred, why don't you walk us through what we're looking at here?
Yeah, so here we're in orbit around a halide world, and you can see a terrain in the bottom and the rotating planet that represents that terrain up above. And at this time, 3D on PCs anyway, and well, just about anything, was just barely starting, and nothing of this quality could have been done at that time. And so in order to achieve this effect, we had to use the tricks that we had at hand, mainly the color mapping technology that we use. But so The first thing that we would do is generate a surface topography. Well, how do we do that? We begin with a height map that is featureless. And then we fracture the height map with 2 lines running from the top to the bottom. Inside the line, we lower the height map. Outside the line, we raise it. And then here's 10 fractures, and here's 500 fractures. And so we would have a fully formed height map. And then after that, we would quantize the height map to 4 levels. And the planet that's rotating has a certain part of the height map that's going to be displayed. And so we would pick that part out, and we would isolate the quantized elevations into masks. And through those masks, we would render 4 spheres.
These are just painted in D-Paint.
Yeah, these are generated offline, and so we would compose the 4 spheres on top of each other, masked appropriately. And this would generate the orbital view of the planet. And then, in order to make it look like the planet was rotating, we would just scroll our window into the generated height map.
Yeah, so that's what it looked like when you were orbiting, and this is what it looked like in the game. There were just dozens and dozens of planets like this, of a ton of different varieties. And you had a couple of other, Fred, what are some of the other techniques that were?
Well, there's the gas giant, which is in the upper left there, and that was broken into bands initially, and then each band was fractured individually. Some storms were added, and then some dithering was done. And then in the upper right, you see a cratered moon, and craters and storms were very similar. The only difference was that craters had an ejecta rim around them so that it looked like something had impacted and something had exploded over it. Yeah, that's about it.
Yeah, so Paul, I want to talk about something that you described to me as hitting your friend in the head with a stick, and that's PvP combat.
Yeah, that is the greatest game of all time, and particularly if your friend has a very small or no stick at all. But it just comes down from being a kid and knowing that competing with your friends in something goofy and sort of emotional and with your body and with your mind all at once is the greatest thing ever.
Yeah, so this is what PvP combat looks like in Star Control 2. You know, there's no PvP combat in the single-player game, but I think it's fair to say that the process of developing PvP made the single-player game stronger.
Yeah, so we built the ships and played in Super Melee long before the story and all of the systems were integrated. And that allowed us to create an interesting variety of characters and powers, and it allowed us to really have great lunch times because we spent a lot of time, both Fred and I, and then we were actually in a suite of offices where there was 4 or 5 small video game companies, Greg Johnson and Mark Bursanger's company, and then eventually Big Ape Software. And so we would meet and blow each other up at lunchtime, and Fred would just sort of be quietly behind the shoulders watching.
Because I had to make the AI eventually, and I would work on it for a while, and then I'd watch not only how 2 humans played against each other, but how somebody who would take on my AI would fare against it, and what techniques they would use to get around it. And so it kind of turned into an arm race. And if beating your friend over the head with a stick is good, beating your friend over the head with a computerized stick might be even better.
And there was this day when things got particularly grim. And usually the ships would have to be close to me to hit me, Fred's ships, and they'd have to have a fast missile, or I could sort of just be clever dodging. And one day the Urquan just turned away from me and shot into open space. And I was like, what's that? And then I slowly floated right into its path. And I realized that Fred was now targeting where I was going to be. And it was, from that point on, it just got worse and worse until finally, with the Arielu Lalile, a little very fast spaceship that can teleport, Fred just finally coded something no one could beat ever at all. And we had to go back and say, that's too good. Make it worse now or no fun.
Wimp.
And you know, the other, I love this combat. Actually, I don't want to brag, but the pekunk at the bottom, this is me fighting Fred's very powerful AI. The reason I die at the beginning is because I was setting up the GIF capture software, so I just want to be clear about that. But you know, as much as I enjoyed the combat, having a really strong AI also gave people who weren't as interested in ship-to-ship combat the ability to play through the narrative game, because they could assign Fred's AI to fight for them.
Yeah, our producer at Accolade at the time, Pam Levins, wasn't particularly interested in combat, and in fact pioneered the fight as little as possible way to win the game. You would use the cyborg player, and I think there was only one or two battles she actually had to fight, and the rest she just stayed away from battle. And it was really fun early on to see how people were tackling the game differently.
Yeah, and so as you notice the pekunk's power here, you know, in keeping with their sort of like neo-mystic personalities, occasionally, at random, when it's blown up, it will just spontaneously resurrect itself and come back for another life. And so that's sort of one of the ways that you guys gave these alien races personality was through their ships. But
I'd also like to point out that their special power is to hurl insults, which regains the energy, and that's actually my voice. And I was so mad at Paul one day that I was able to do that all in one take.
We can't remember what it was about, but it worked out well.
Another miracle of digitized sound effects. But in addition to the ships having personality, in Star Control 2, you sort of introduced the idea that you would have conversations with these aliens. This is an early prototype of the Star Control 2 conversation interface with what looks like a sort of a cannibal demon with really outstanding pecs.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure where he came from, but we would use DPaint to mock up UIs to let us think about what that would be like. And you can see over in the lower right, we were thinking at this point about actually using the same conversation system for Murder on the Zender and Starflight, which that was great, again, because when you picked your hostile question, you could see something funny and surprising that you'd written. But in fact, the alternative of showing multiple possible things you could say at once gives this great opportunity for humor and seeing the kinds of things you could say.
And this is kind of how that looks. This is just a snippet, but enough to show more or less how you put jokes together. And I'm curious what your writing process was like for the actual content of these conversations, because there's so much text in the game, but it all is very tight. There are good jokes. It flows. It doesn't really, if someone talks for too long, there's generally a comedic reason for it.
Yeah, there's a part where Fufo goes on for like 20 minutes about his life story. You make the mistake of asking him that. So in part, it was, we started out with flowcharts. Eventually, after many, many months, Fred sat me down and said, you really need to write this out in a form that people understand and is permanent and you won't keep changing. So drew it out all in pencil on a huge piece of cardboard that we still have. And then in each conversation, we went in and made a flowchart, which Fred would then implement in C. But the statements would be like, alien hello 5, and hostile goodbye, and prepare to die human. And the game would run with those. The logic would execute. And then I would either go in and write those statements or get on the phone to my friends or anyone we could find on the street to please come help us write alien dialogue. In fact, at one point, Accolade was really wonderful in helping us get this done, but there were times when I wasn't entirely sure they understood what we were making, because when at the Alien Hello 4 phase, they kind of thought that's what we meant and intended. But many, many, many months later, we finished all the text.
I'd also like to point out here that this is a good example of where a lot of our little technique explorations all came together, and also just a lot of the help from our friends. So obviously we have mod music playing over this. We have a painting that was probably scanned in, and then somebody animated the little hand motions. We have text that was written by an author. And so we sort of combine the works of a lot of people into this conversation system where the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, I think.
Yeah, and so in addition to the actual content of what the aliens are saying to sort of give themselves and their, by extension, their species personality, the typography in this game is very deliberate as well. And Paul, you have sort of a long history of being a font head.
I've always loved fonts. I used to read Pogo Possum, this two on the right, and it was the first time I actually saw characters speaking in different shapes of letters, and that meant something to me. And so when we started, Errol and I started creating our own books in high school, we leapt right into the deep end with Gothic, which no one could read. So we learned my lesson on that for the most part. And in Star Control, I was desperately wanting text to be kerned, because that's another sort of fetish of mine. So Fred, being a very patient man, was willing to let me go off for like a month and write a font editing system in BASIC. And as I said, I'm not a programmer. That's one of the great things about working with Fred, which is he won't simply tell me that's stupid, let me do that in an afternoon. So I fiddled around and finally got this font editing system, and then was able to go through and generate the fonts for the different characters, and I hope that that helped give them a different personality.
Well, yeah, and you can see sort of where the Spothy is sort of just very straightforward, almost has like a I don't know, it's sort of a quirky, like chunky in a charming way quality to it. There's this malevolent brain toad, the Dinyari later in the game, who speaks in these sort of menacing capital letters before he hacks your brain to ask him about flowers instead of his...
I think, by the way, the Hypnotoad conflict about is our Hypnotoad first, or is the Simpsons, or the Futurama Hypnotoad first. That hasn't been settled yet, but maybe it's just we both came up with it.
You know, it's the Hypnotoad was just in the air. It was the time. And so clearly the painterly art is also an important part of defining these species' personality. And you kind of had a personal connection to the place that came from.
Sure. So this is all George Barr, a Bay Area artist who I grew up seeing his book covers, and I loved his stuff. And it's very pulp science fiction. It's straight up colorful, exaggerated, sensual. And seeing it in book covers and seeing it on, swords and sorcery book covers, I was really fascinated, but I didn't connect it with this poster as a young 70s man I had on my wall for Flash Gordon, which was a take on the Flash Gordon myth. And he had done this painting years past. He also was infamous for doing the makeup on the Way to Eden episode of the original Star Trek, the Space Hippies. I don't know how he got that job, but he was very proud of it. But we tracked him down. He actually had done some work for John at Automated Simulations, which later became Epics. And we went and said, hey, can you paint us some aliens? And then we ended up also having him paint many of the images for the storytelling parts. And he did paintings, Errol Otis did paintings, and then there were some done by hand.
Yeah, Errol Otis's stuff is this is sort of some almost like the Sunday Comics take on some of the characters from the game. This was in the manual, right?
These are from manuals. Actually, one of them is from Starflight in the upper right, Humna Humna. But so Errol was an illustrator at TSR Hobbies, and in the lower left you can see that's one of the Cthulian buddies. And he has a beautiful, very unusual, unique style. You can always tell when you see an Errol illustration. And so not only did he do an awful lot for the early Dungeons & Dragons games, but he also helped us with paintings and with manual illustrations and music and text and voice acting in the 3DO version. So he wins the award for actually touching the most parts of the game.
Human Swiss Army knife.
Yeah.
Yeah. One of the most fascinating documents that I found was this production schedule. This is from mid-1991. It was you guys projecting what you were going to be doing sort of month to month for the next year and a half. I guess you were still in sort of an optimistic schedule at that point. Fred, when did you sit Paul down and sort of make him tie all the loose ends together?
Well, it was pretty much, I guess, when this schedule purports to have ended, maybe a couple months later. But that was right around the time we stopped getting paid by Accolade. And I would point out that Accolade was no longer obligated to pay us because we had overrun our contract. But I don't want that, seeing that people from our current publisher are in the room right now, I don't want that to be taken as an established precedent.
The industry has moved on so far since then, and yet here we are. We're not being paid for this. So what can, sorry, Rob, we didn't tell you this.
I have a couple of lunch tickets that say different.
But it put an interesting crimp on the old development to not be getting paid, because at this time we needed money and for family and friends, and fortunately that's where Fred's very disciplined approach to life came in, thankfully.
Luckily I had money in the bank and I was able to finance our lives for the remainder of the project. And I think I even got a producer credit in the manual for that. So.
Well, it's like you guys sort of spent the first 3/4 of development as like AAA, as a AAA shop, and then the last 6 months you just kind of went indie, like on the same game. But the final, this is March of 1992. The game actually ships in November of 1992. It does very well. It's critically acclaimed. This is a Computer Gaming World Review from March of 1993, so they took their time, which was good. And the guy closes by saying, Star Control 2 has been placed on this reviewer's top 10 list of all time. This has been one of the most enjoyable games to review all year. It's not often that such a perfect balance is struck between role-playing, adventure, and action arcade. Often, and that's it.
Concerns.
Concerns.
I think not only that, you were also named the best sports game of 1992.
Yeah, it was a complete Cinderella story.
Yeah, thank God for that.
And sadly, it was a golf game from Accolade that had to content themselves with winning Best Science Fiction Game of the Year because somehow they got the stickers reversed.
Well,
seriously.
They stopped paying the sticker people also.
Yeah.
And there was a minor revolt. Actually, that's not the end of the story for Star Control, because, Paul, shortly after the game had been released, you were sort of contracted to make a 3DO version under sort of interesting circumstances.
Yeah, we had moved on and created a game called The Horde for Crystal Dynamics, and we had a deal going where we were going to do a Sega CD version of The Horde, and we lured some friends to quit their boring normal jobs and come join the great world of games. The weekend before they showed up, that was canceled. The project was canceled. So I called up the head of the company, Madeline Canepa, and I'm just like, is there something we can do so that I don't have to fire these people on day one? Because that would be a real record for us of just 1 day of employment. Now, subsequently, we did beat that with a 0 day of employment employee. But Madeline said, sure, what do you want to do? And we said, well, we kind of like to go back and make Star Control really cool on the 3DO. And she said, okay. So we called up Accolade, which owned at this point the rights to the trademark, and said, hey, and we ended up paying them for our own game to create. But so we got it over there, and then just the lure of the CD called, original Star Control.
This is another example of the industry just sort of passing us by as now there's this gigantic amount of static data you can put on disk.
So we ended up shifting audio, in many cases, to Redbook, to CD audio. We hired a company to do kind of a movie, a 3D rendered movie. We recorded 11 hours of voiceovers, and I think it's debatable whether or not the overall impression was stronger with and without that, but it set a tone of now you must create a lot of stuff for a product.
Yeah. Just through the arc of this game, we went from 2 people to farming out things and just numbers of people.
Yeah.
Well, and so much of Star Control 2, I feel like in the PC version, was about you guys kind of overcoming these constraints. Fred, you told me that the planet rotation that we saw before, that to make that work, even with the hack that you devised, you had to sort of implement your own version of threading?
I don't know whether I specifically had to implement threading for that, but I did implement threading because it made it easier to rotate the planet, to play the mod music, to do other functions that the game required sort of in parallel as much as could be done at that time. And interestingly enough, if you ever played Star Control 2 from the PC speaker, we had to run the timer so fast in order to wiggle the speaker so that the digital audio sounded not half bad, that it wreaked havoc with the BIOS clock, and I had to continually restore the expected time.
Otherwise, people would quit the game and still be in the future.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. I have one last question, and I'll ask it for the benefit of every fan in the audience. And the question is, will you make a sequel?
Absolutely.
How's it coming along?
Well, it's been a very consistent effort over the past 23 years. Fred, this is our sort of retirement / we got fired project. And we keep saying, okay, if this next thing, if this crazy idea with like toys and adventure games and for kids, if this goes bad, we're doing Star Control. And then that went okay.
So you've pretty much guaranteed yourself an epic run of success.
Yeah, well, hopefully,
Yeah.
or 30 years from now, we can come back here and do the postmortem.
Yeah. I'll see you there. I think we actually do have time for questions if anybody wants to ask Paul and Fred something. But in the meantime, let's give it up for these guys.
Hi. Can I go first? Yes. Okay. I'm going to ask something that probably a lot of people are going to want to ask, but what's up with the oars?
Well, let's see. I believe they were described as the fingers pushing in from somewhere else. Originally, they were just these happy-go-lucky alcohol breathers in the original pitch. And then when Star Control 2 started, we wanted to pull in a Cthulhian, creepy feel and sort of eat the androsynth or remove the androsynth from the story for a moment. And just as we ended up writing them, they got spookier and spookier. And the Arilulalile, these sort of space aliens, tell you that they're on your side, that they've been coming into your bedroom at night and fixing your smell so that the oar's fingers can't find you. And that all sounds pretty weird to me. We were on top of an office supply store at this point, and when we were doing playtesting, we sort of went anywhere, anybody nearby who could playtest, and this nice gentleman downstairs wanted to playtest. Unbeknownst to us, he was a Roswell fancier, and decided that somehow we knew more than he did, and wanted to know if the Arilu were actually kind of revealing something about the Roswell. And we tried to be polite, but the simple answer is, as far as we know, no, they are simply in your bedrooms late at night, fixing your smell.
Just the office supplies, please.
Let's go to another microphone.
Well, first I just wanted to say that the asymmetric fighting, this and as well as Archon, I think were precursors to the whole fighting game genre, like Street Fighter, and so as a competitive fighting gamer, I really appreciated those games. But my question was about a sequel. There's been online rumors that Stardock is working on a Star Control 4, and I was wondering if you guys were involved in that.
We are not involved. We've had talks with them, but we're not involved at this time.
They, when Accolade / Atari / the various companies that acquired it went out of business, they had the trademark Star Control. All of the material, all the aliens, all of the story belongs to Fred and myself. So they're taking the trademark and moving forward with that.
Okay, thank you.
Left mic.
Sure. First, I just want to say that Star Control, and Star Control 2 especially, is one of the most influential games that I ever played, and I absolutely love it.
Thank you.
The one thing that I was really fascinated about the first time I went through the game was that apparently when the Urquan capture the Earth, they destroy various places on the surface, and one of them tantalizingly is described as being under the sea. And I'm just dying to know what it was.
They also hit Antarctica, I think.
Yeah, that was probably Atlantis, I think.
The Urquan practice, when they didn't destroy you, the Urquan Serza, would just destroy your history. That was the first thing, because history caused trouble. So they would, from orbit, scan your planet's surface and determine what were your most important historical artifacts and erase them. And they didn't know that we didn't know about Atlantis, and we didn't know about the creepy, Cyclopean cities in the Antarctic ice. And they just blew them all up.
Yeah, as a serious enthusiast of Lovecraft at the time, too, I assumed, oh, well, it's Rillier and the old ones.
The Shoggoths could raise trouble, so.
Seriously. Thanks.
Back to the middle, I think.
Hello. Just to start, whenever people ask me what my favorite game of all time was, I actually say Archon, which I realize might be heretical in this room, but Star Control 2 is my favorite space game. So you guys get double credit for that. Now I have to make up a question to ask. But my curiosity is when you guys played in the internal playtesting and whatnot, which ship came out as the best?
I think different people had different mastery of ships.
And a nice reviewer called it the rock, scissors, vapor effect, where if you were really good with the Arilu, you could wreak havoc on someone like the Urquan.
Arlu was a bastard.
Yeah, actually, Rob was pretty good with the Arilu. We actually had a couple of battles early today, and he was very kind on me.
Calm the nerves. Yeah.
So I did not equip myself well. My brother would have been ashamed.
My old experience was the Arlu beat a lot of stuff. The Avatar beat everything small, and maybe the Urquan or the Utwig could beat the Avatar, and that was about it.
If you were good with the Suphawks, you could wreak some havoc. And what was funny was we played it for years, and over the course of time, there would just be like, a rally. The Umga would come back, and all of a sudden, like, oh, what do we do? So it's very personal. It's sort of like with Archon, some people insisted that the dark side was much more powerful, and others would insist that the light side was much more powerful, except for the Phoenix, which I'm really sorry about that. That really didn't play very well, but.
Go ahead.
So I was a bigger fan of video games than comic books growing up. Like, I didn't really read any comics. Then I saw this commercial for the Guardians of the Galaxy and started thinking, this is a less developed version of the Shafixty. Was that one of your, I assume that was one of your influences, or?
Nope. I love Rocket Raccoon. He's a great character. But the Shofixty were just sweet little rat guys. I think we were reading David Brin's The Uplift War at the time, and the idea of one race uplifting another was interesting to us. So the Yehat being this sort of like super Scottish clan-based warrior race, like who would they uplift? And so like some sort of ferocious little super rodent creature they would bring up. And then we sort of went off on this in Tanaka. He was sort of the lost soldier in World War II who didn't know the war was over. And that's how he came about. And about the bevy of maidens, less said the better, I think.
So we definitely borrowed liberally, but not from that.
Throughout the store and the lore, there's several mentions of the Ilroth cloaking device. And more than 15 years ago, I was learning programming throughout writing a data unpacker to the game, the original game. And I found these graphic files, which I think relate to the cloaking device. So could you walk through, like, tell the full story, like, what happened to the cloaking device and
Sure. Fred, what happened to the cloaking device?
I think that might have been in the game for a while, and we took it out, but I can't remember why we took it out.
Yeah, when we were going through the data with Rob, there's actually a screen that I handed off to Greg Hammond, an artist who is working on some of those icons. And in there, it specifically calls out, this is a module for the ship, which is the cloaking module. And there was a couple of features that we wanted to keep working on, but sort of time and money and reality intruded. The cloaking device was one. The very self-serving conversation with ourselves. We made the skeleton of a conversation. You could find us on Groombridge and talk with us, and if we got mad, horrible things would happen. But one, we did realize that was a little self-serving, and two, that was when Accolade was finally insisting we needed to be done with the game. But good job finding it.
All right. Thanks, guys.
I was curious how the ideas for some of the alien races came about. Did it start with a personality, or their history, or the ship abilities, or an image? Or
Yes.
Yeah, it's come from a variety of different directions. So in some cases, in Star Control 1, we would just sort of casually say, oh, these are these cowardly aliens because they have butt missiles and shoot backwards. And then in Star Control 2, it's like, okay, you better justify this. And so we would pick the starting point of, you know, okay, they're battle thralls. They've got to be the worst battle thralls ever because they're terrified of everything. And so then the sort of when you meet Quiffo and find out that he has been left to guard the solar system and has successfully retreated from the ultimate evil out to finally Pluto. And then other races, the Ors are an interesting example where we had the graphic that George Barr had painted, and I asked Earl to help write, and he went off, I think, camping, and I got this sheet of yellow paper back along with a statement that he couldn't complete the writing, but could we work with this? And there was just things like dancing and happy campers. And so Greg Johnson, then I said, Greg, can you help me? And he took this piece of paper and just began making it into a language. And so that one, we had a friend, Matt Genzer, who, there's a story by Jack Vance called The Moon Moth about masks, this society with masks and musical instruments. And we gave him the Ootwig to write, and he just kind of went to town with it. And then somehow the Ultron, their kind of sad relationship with this genuinely important artifact that they keep breaking emerged from that. So a lot of it just came out of living in their skins for a while and then asking ourselves, well, what would they do now?
Looks like we have one last question. And then I believe we can go to there's a spillover area.
I think they told us we could stay as long as we needed to. Since
How are we doing time-wise?
All right, Andy has to go. Got it.
We'll be over at the roundup spillover.
They said we can stay here as long as we want.
Cool. Yeah. Great. All right.
Yes. Yes, so there is a game out there that has the title Star Control 3. And while I know that you gentlemen were not actually involved with that project, there are a number of plot details and sort of setting details and whatnot that do feel like they follow on pretty logically from what was in Star Control 2. So I'm curious, despite you not being directly involved with the project at that point, how much of that did they actually take from like notes you left behind and whatnot, and how much of that did they just make up completely? Are the precursors cows? That's what I'm asking.
Well, that's a tricky one. I'm going to give them most of the credit for it because Fred and I were occupied. There was it's interesting. I ran into a similar plot lately in a story, Prador Moon, I think, in which there's an alien species which, in order to avoid some even more horrible alien species, devolves themselves back into a very primitive form to effectively hide. And that, rolling back to when we were talking about it, I think that was the one idea that we talked about, which is, but that is not, in fact, what happened. That was a dream. And what is actually happening is fascinating, and we'll tell you someday.
All right. Well, in that case, Star Control 3 when?
Oh. All right. So can we? Is
one more?
Keep what?
I think we can keep going if we want.
I'm getting a wave off from.
Okay.
So are we going to go over to?
Sure.
Is there
so we'll unmic ourselves. We'll devolve.
Okay.
Thank
you very much.
Thank you.